September 1843, South Carolina. Thomas Whitmore is dead. The doctor signs influenza complications. His wife Rebecca performs her grief at the funeral. His son James inherits the plantation without a second thought. To everyone watching, it's just another natural death in the Low Country. Tragic, but ordinary. But at the very back of the burial line stands an older woman with gray hair and hands permanently stained green from years of working with plants. Her name is Aminata. And what nobody notices that day is this. Whitmore didn't die from sickness. He died from patience. 6 months earlier, Aminata buried her 16-year-old son after an overseer forced him into the fields with fever in his lungs. No investigation, no mercy, no justice. So she made her own, quietly, carefully, and so slowly it looked like nature doing what nature does. Here's the question that will keep tightening every minute you stay. If a death looks natural, who benefits from that label? And what if the most trusted hands in the house are the ones rewriting fate? Watch closely, because by the end, the smallest details, a flower, a cup, a whispered goodbye, will change everything you thought you saw. 6 months before Thomas Whitmore's death, his 180 enslaved people faced their annual nightmare, the February influenza outbreak that swept through the cramped, poorly ventilated quarters every winter like clockwork. The plantation doctor, Dr. Blake, would arrive once, prescribe bed rest for white family members, and tell the overseer that enslaved people had naturally strong constitutions and should continue working unless they literally couldn't stand. This medical philosophy killed approximately 5 to 8 people every year, a mortality rate Thomas Whitmore considered acceptable, a cost of doing business, losses noted in his ledger, with the same emotional investment he gave to recording broken plow equipment. In February 1843, the outbreak was particularly severe. 23 people fell sick in the first week. By week 2, that number had climbed to 47. The quarters became a maze of coughing, fever-shaking bodies, people trying to sleep while others beside them struggled to breathe. Aminata, who served as the unofficial plantation healer, moved from cabin to cabin with her cloth bag of herbs, dried roots, and tinctures, doing what she could with the limited resources slavery permitted her. She brewed fever-reducing teas from willow bark. She made poultices for chest congestion using mustard seed and lard. She sat with the dying and whispered comfort in languages they half remembered from childhoods in Africa or from parents who remembered Africa. Her son Samuel, 16 years old, fell sick on February 14th. He woke that morning with a fever and a cough that sounded like gravel in his lungs. Aminata recognized immediately that this was serious, not the mild flu that healthy young people recovered from, but the dangerous kind that could drown a person in their own fluid-filled lungs. She went immediately to Overseer Marcus Grayson and requested that Samuel be excused from field work until the fever broke. Grayson, a man whose primary qualification for his position was his willingness to inflict violence without moral hesitation, refused. "Every Negro on this plantation works unless they're dead," he said. "Fever ain't dead. Get that boy to the rice fields, or I'll take it out of his hide and yours." Aminata tried to explain, tried to make him understand that Samuel's lungs were filling, that pushing him to work in the cold February fields would kill him. Grayson responded by threatening 20 lashes if Samuel wasn't at work within the hour. So Samuel went to the fields. He went because he had no choice, because slavery didn't recognize the right to be sick, because his mother's knowledge, her desperate pleading, meant nothing against white authority. He worked that day standing knee-deep in the cold water of the rice paddies bending and planting, his body shaking with fever, his cough worsening by the hour. He worked the next day, and the day after that. On the 4th day, February 18th, 1843, Samuel collapsed face first into the muddy water. 2 other enslaved men pulled him out, carried his unconscious body back to the quarters, and laid him on the wooden sleeping platform he shared with 3 others. Aminata sat with her son for 3 days. She tried everything she knew. Every herb, every prayer, every technique her mother had taught her back in Africa before she was captured at age 12 and sold into this American nightmare. She held Samuel's hand while his breathing became more labored. She whispered stories about his grandmother, about the village where Aminata had been born, about freedom and dignity and justice. On February 21st at 4:17 in the morning, Samuel stopped breathing. His last words, whispered so softly that only Aminata heard them, were, "Mama, I'm so cold." He was 16 years old, strong, healthy, full of potential, and he died because Overseer Grayson valued cotton production over human life, because Master Whitmore's wealth was built on the principle that enslaved bodies were expendable resources, because the system of slavery functioned on the fundamental belief that black lives could be sacrificed to white profit. Aminata did not cry when Samuel died. She sat motionless beside his body as the February dawn broke through the gaps in the quarter's walls. She sat motionless while other enslaved people came to pay respects, bringing flowers they'd hidden in pockets, singing spiritual softly. She sat motionless while Overseer Grayson arrived at 6:30 a.m. and told everyone to get back to work, that they'd already wasted enough time, that Samuel would be buried that evening after work was done. She remained motionless during the burial, watching Samuel's body lowered into the ground in the far corner of the plantation cemetery, where enslaved people were buried without coffins, without markers, without acknowledgement. She stood motionless while Master Thomas Whitmore walked past the burial without stopping, without looking, without a single word of acknowledgement that a human being had died on his property due to his overseer's cruelty and his own indifference. But inside, behind that motionless exterior, something fundamental crystallized. Not explosive rage. Rage got enslaved people killed, but something colder, harder, more patient. A decision, a plan, a promise to her dead son. Thomas Whitmore would die. Not quickly, not mercifully, not in any way that would endanger other enslaved people or be traced back to her. He would die slowly, suffering, experiencing the same helplessness Samuel had felt. And it would look like natural causes, like one of the many diseases that claimed plantation owners in the disease-ridden South Carolina lowcountry. Aminata had been born in 1800 in what white people called the Gold Coast of Africa, in a village that cultivated extensive knowledge of plants and their properties. Her mother had been a healer, part of a lineage of women who understood that every plant contained power, power to heal, power to harm, power to alter consciousness or stop hearts. This knowledge was sacred, passed from mother to daughter, through careful instruction, through memorization of hundreds of plant species and their effects, through understanding that the same leaf that cured a child's fever could, in different doses or preparations, kill an adult. When Aminata was captured at age 12 during a raid that killed her father and brothers, she carried this knowledge with her across the Middle Passage, through the horror of the auction block in Charleston, through 18 years of slavery on 3 different plantations, before being sold to Whitmore Plantation in 1830. The knowledge sustained her. It gave her value as a healer, which gave her slightly better treatment than field hands. It gave her power that white people didn't recognize because they didn't understand it. It gave her secrets. She knew, for instance, that white snake root, a plant that grew abundantly in the wooded areas around Whitmore Plantation, contained a toxin called trematol. When consumed by cows, it made their milk poisonous, causing what white doctors called milk sickness, a mysterious illness that killed thousands of people in frontier America. Abraham Lincoln's mother had died of milk sickness in 1818, but milk sickness was unpredictable. It required the cow to eat the plant, required someone to drink that specific cow's milk, required a chain of circumstances Aminata couldn't control. She knew that oleander, grown as ornamental plants around the Whitmore big house, contained cardiac glycosides that could stop a heart. But oleander was too obviously poisonous, too well known. If someone died after consuming it, even the incompetent Dr. Blake might suspect foul play. She knew that water hemlock, which grew in the marshy areas near the rice fields, was one of North America's most violently poisonous plants, but its effects were dramatic. Convulsions, frothing at the mouth, obvious symptoms that screamed poison. What Aminata needed was something subtle, something that mimicked common illness, something that could be administered in tiny doses over time, building slowly, creating symptoms that looked like natural disease. Something that gave her control, allowing her to extend suffering while maintaining the appearance of trying to help. She found her answer in foxglove, digitalis purpurea, a beautiful flowering plant with bell-shaped purple flowers that grew in partial shade. White people cultivated it in their gardens for its beauty, unaware that every part of the plant contained potent cardiac glycosides. In controlled medical doses, extracted properly, digitalis could regulate irregular heartbeats. But in slightly higher doses, or when accumulated in the body over time, it caused nausea, vomiting, confusion, visual disturbances, including seeing yellow halos around lights, irregular heartbeat, and eventually cardiac arrest. The symptoms mimicked various diseases. Initial doses looked like stomach ailments. Continued exposure looked like declining health, like aging, like the body simply wearing out. Doctors in the 1940s had limited diagnostic tools. They relied on symptoms, and digitalis poisoning symptoms were similar enough to common illnesses that a moderately skilled poisoner could disguise the cause of. Death completely. Aminata had access to foxglove. Rebecca Whitmore maintained an extensive flower garden where foxglove grew in decorative clusters. Aminata had permission to collect flowers for the house, a task Rebecca assigned her because Aminata had demonstrated good taste in floral arrangements. This meant Aminata could harvest foxglove regularly without suspicion. She spent the month of March 1843 preparing. She collected foxglove leaves at different growth stages, learning which leaves contained the highest concentration of glycosides. She experimented with drying methods, discovering that slow, drying in shade preserved potency better than sun drying. She ground dried leaves into fine powder using a mortar and pestle she kept hidden in her cabin. She tested different dilution methods, creating a tincture by soaking the powder in a small amount of alcohol she'd distilled from fermented rice mash, a skill she'd learned from another enslaved person years ago. She tested her preparations on the plantation's barn rats, creatures nobody would miss. She learned the proper dosage. Too much killed within hours, too obvious. Too little had no effect. But the correct amount, approximately 1/8 of a teaspoon of her concentrated tincture, created mild nausea and lethargy in a full-grown rat. Repeated doses over days created cumulative effects, confusion, weakness, eventually death that looked like the rat had simply gotten old and sick. By April, she was ready. But she didn't rush. Rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes led to discovery. Instead, she waited for the perfect opportunity, a circumstance that would give her regular, unsupervised access to Thomas Whitmore's food or drink. That opportunity arrived in late July 1843, when Rebecca Whitmore announced she would be traveling to Charleston for a month to visit her sister. She would take 2 house servants with her, leaving the plantation under Thomas's sole supervision. This meant Thomas would be eating meals prepared by the remaining kitchen staff, meals over which Aminata, as the senior cook, had complete control. Rebecca's departure date was set for August 1st. Aminata began her campaign on August 3rd. The first dose went into Thomas Whitmore's morning coffee, a beverage he consumed in quantities that would give modern doctors concern, typically 4 cups between waking at 6 a.m. and departing for his daily plantation rounds at 9 a.m. The coffee was black, bitter, and strong enough to mask the slight bitterness of digitalis tincture, 1/8 of a teaspoon mixed into his second cup of the morning. The dose was conservative, designed to test his reaction to ensure he didn't have unusual sensitivity that might kill him immediately. Aminata needed him to die slowly, needed time to watch him suffer, needed the satisfaction of extended vengeance. Thomas showed no reaction that first day. No nausea, no distress, nothing. This was expected. Digitalis took time to build in the system. Aminata continued, 1 dose every morning in his coffee, sometimes 1 dose every other morning to vary the pattern, to make accumulation slower and less obvious. By August 15th, Thomas began complaining of stomach upset. He mentioned to Overseer Grayson that he felt slightly off, though he couldn't identify specific symptoms. By August 22nd, he was experiencing intermittent nausea, loss of appetite, and fatigue. He attributed this to the summer heat, to the stress of managing the plantation alone, to getting older. He was 58 after all. These things happened. Dr. Blake was summoned on August 25th. He examined Thomas, noted the symptoms, and diagnosed a mild digestive disorder, common in the South Carolina summer. He prescribed bed rest, bland foods, and a tonic of his own creation that consisted primarily of alcohol and herbs. The tonic did nothing because the problem wasn't digestive. The problem was that Thomas Whitmore's heart was slowly being poisoned, and every dose of digitalis aminata added to his food pushed him closer to cardiac failure. Aminata, in her role as cook, was asked to prepare bland foods for Master Whitmore's delicate stomach. She did so with perfect compliance, creating rice porridge, clear broths, and weak tea. And into these carefully prepared invalid foods, she continued adding her tincture, small amounts, carefully measured, invisible in the bland flavors. Rebecca Whitmore returned from Charleston on September 1st. She found her husband noticeably declined, pale, weak, spending most of his time in bed. She was concerned but not alarmed. Men of Thomas's age often experience declining health. Dr. Blake was summoned again, conducted another examination, and suggested that Thomas might be experiencing the early stages of heart disease. This was closer to the truth than Blake realized, though the disease wasn't natural. Aminata increased the dosage slightly. By September 10th, Thomas was experiencing visual disturbances, seeing yellow tinges around lights, difficulty focusing. By September 15th, his heartbeat became irregular, sometimes racing, sometimes slowing to alarming levels. By September 20th, he was largely bedridden, barely eating, extremely weak, confused about dates and names. Rebecca panicked. She had Dr. Blake visit daily. She sent for a specialist from Charleston, a doctor with more training, who examined Thomas and speculated about various diseases. Yellow fever, perhaps, though the presentation wasn't quite right. Malaria? Possible, though Thomas had survived malaria before. Some new disease. The Low Country was full of mysterious ailments. Nobody suspected poison. Why would they? Aminata was the one caring for Thomas, bringing him meals, administering Dr. Blake's useless tonics, sitting with him during his worst moments. She played the role of concerned servant perfectly, expressing worry about the master's health, praying visibly for his recovery, doing everything a loyal slave would do, and, through it all, she continued adding tiny amounts of digitalis to his food. Not every meal now, that would be too risky with Rebecca watching more carefully. But every other meal, every third meal, maintaining the toxic level in his system while avoiding suspicion. Thomas Whitmore died on September 23, 1843, at 3:30 in the afternoon. His heart, damaged by months of accumulated digitalis, simply stopped. He was surrounded by his family, attended by 2 doctors, and cared for by enslaved people, including Aminata, who held his hand in his final moments and whispered in a language he didn't understand. "This is for Samuel. This is for every mother's child you've destroyed. May you find the justice you denied us." The official cause of death was listed as heart failure due to unknown illness, possibly a new variant of low-country fever. Thomas Whitmore was buried 3 days later with full honors, mourned by his family and the white community. His death considered tragic, but not suspicious. Natural causes, these things happened. The morning after Thomas Whitmore's funeral, Aminata woke at 4:30 a.m. as she had for 31 years of enslavement. The routine didn't change because a master died. The plantation still needed feeding, the big house still required cleaning, and enslaved people still rose before dawn to serve white people who would sleep until the sun was high. But something fundamental had shifted in Aminata's internal landscape. For the first time since Samuel's death 7 months earlier, she didn't wake with that crushing weight on her chest, that suffocating grief that made breathing feel like labor. She walked to the kitchen house in the pre-dawn darkness, her feet following paths worn smooth by decades of identical journeys. The September air was cooler now, the brutal summer heat finally breaking. Spanish moss hung motionless from the live oak trees, and somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird began its elaborate morning song. Aminata paused for a moment, actually hearing the bird, actually noticing the beauty of dawn breaking over the plantation. She hadn't noticed beauty in 7 months. Grief and rage had consumed all space for beauty. But now, with Thomas Whitmore dead and buried, with her son's death balanced by careful vengeance, there was room again. Not for happiness, slavery made happiness impossible, but for something quieter, a sense of completion, of accounts settled, of maternal duty fulfilled in the only way this brutal system permitted. The kitchen house was dark when she arrived. She lit the lamps, built up the fire in the massive cooking hearth, and began preparing breakfast for the Whitmore family and their house guests. Rebecca had family staying through the week, relatives who had come for the funeral and lingered to help with estate matters. This meant larger meals, more elaborate preparations, more work. Aminata moved through these tasks with the efficiency of long practice, her hands working independently while her mind drifted. She thought about the moment Thomas Whitmore had taken his last breath, how she'd been standing right there, how his eyes had met hers with something that might have been recognition or might have been the confusion of a dying brain. She had felt nothing in that moment. No triumph, no satisfaction, no guilt. Just a calm acknowledgement that a necessary task was complete. Esther, the oldest enslaved woman on the plantation, arrived in the kitchen at 5:15 a.m. She was 73 years old, had been enslaved at Whitmore Plantation for 56 years, and had the kind of wisdom that came from surviving multiple generations of masters. She looked at Aminata with eyes that had seen everything, eyes that missed nothing. "You sleeping better now?" Esther asked quietly, beginning to peel potatoes for the breakfast. "Some," Aminata replied, measuring coffee grounds with careful precision. Esther nodded slowly. "Samuel can rest now. Whoever was keeping him troubled is gone." The words hung in the air between them. Not quite an accusation, not quite an acknowledgement, but something in between. Aminata met Esther's eyes and saw understanding there, not judgment. Esther had lost 4 children to slavery, 2 sold away, 2 dead from plantation brutality. She understood the mathematics of maternal grief. "The ancestors accept certain offerings," Aminata said softly, using a phrase her mother had taught her back in Africa. Words that meant justice sometimes requires blood, sometimes requires patience, sometimes requires actions that living people couldn't speak about directly. Esther hummed, returning to her potatoes. "Coffee do smell bitter these days. Funny how that happens sometimes." They worked in companionable silence after that, 2 women who understood each other perfectly without needing to say the dangerous things out loud. This was how knowledge passed between enslaved people, through careful indirection, through metaphor, through silences that said more than words could safely express. James Whitmore, Thomas's 28-year-old son, took control of the plantation the week after the funeral. He was different from his father in temperament, less openly cruel, more concerned with efficiency than punishment. He had been educated in Charleston, had traveled to England, and had returned with ideas about modern plantation management that emphasized incentive structures over pure brutality. This didn't make him good. It made him a more sophisticated oppressor, someone who understood that enslaved people worked harder when given small rewards than when only given punishments, someone who calculated that keeping families together increased productivity, someone who saw slavery as a business that could be optimized rather than a simple system of racial domination. His motivations were economic, not humanitarian, but the practical effects meant slightly less violence, slightly more stability, slightly better living conditions in the quarters. His first act as plantation master was to dismiss overseer Marcus Grayson, the man who had forced Samuel to work while deathly ill. James brought in a new overseer, a younger man named William Perry, who had a reputation for strict but less violent management. This decision rippled through the enslaved community with cautious hope. Hope was dangerous in slavery. Hope led to disappointment. But the removal of Grayson meant something. Aminata watched these changes with the careful attention she gave to everything. She noted that James visited the quarters more often than his father had, that he actually listened when enslaved people reported equipment problems or sick animals, that he ordered the construction of a new infirmary building with better ventilation. She noted these things and filed them away, not as evidence of James's goodness, but as information about his character, his priorities, his vulnerabilities. Because Aminata had learned an important truth in the 7 months since Samuel's death. She had killed Thomas Whitmore and gotten away with it. This knowledge changed something fundamental in how she understood power. She wasn't powerless. None of them were completely powerless, even in slavery. They simply had to be more careful, more patient, more strategic about how they wielded what little power they possessed. This realization both liberated and troubled her. Liberated because it meant agency existed even in bondage. Troubled because it raised uncomfortable questions. Should she have killed Thomas Whitmore? Morally, ethically, spiritually? She didn't know. The Christianity that white preachers shouted about forbade murder, commanded forgiveness, promised that God would handle justice. But Aminata had never fully accepted Christianity. She respected it, used it when strategically useful, but her deepest beliefs remained rooted in the African spirituality her mother had taught her, spirituality that had different understandings of justice, of ancestors, of the balance that must exist between harm and retribution. In African understanding, Samuel's unavenged death would have troubled the spirit world, would have left his soul restless, would have created an imbalance that affected the entire community. Aminata's actions restored balance. Not perfectly. Nothing about slavery could be perfect. But she had honored her son, had proven that his life mattered, had demonstrated that even enslaved mothers possessed the power to protect their children, even if that protection came after death. Still, she wondered. Late at night, lying on her sleeping pallet in the small cabin she occupied alone now that Samuel was gone, she wondered, had she become what she hated? Had she lowered herself to Thomas Whitmore's level by taking a life? These questions didn't have easy answers, and Aminata didn't pretend they did. She sat with the moral complexity, let it exist without resolution, accepted that righteous vengeance and wrongful murder might somehow be the same action viewed from different angles. What she didn't feel was regret. That absence of regret told her something important about herself, something that might have frightened her in different circumstances. She had the capacity for calculated violence. She could plan death meticulously and execute that plan without hesitation. This made her dangerous in ways that plantation masters never suspected. Dangerous precisely because she looked like what they expected. An aging, enslaved woman, useful for her skills, invisible in her servitude. Rebecca Whitmore remained on the plantation through October, helping James transition into his new role. She was grieving, genuinely it seemed, though Aminata questioned whether Rebecca mourned Thomas himself, or simply mourned her status as wife rather than widow. Rebecca had always been more concerned with social standing than emotional connection. Aminata watched Rebecca carefully during this period, alert for any sign of suspicion. But Rebecca showed none. She accepted Dr. Blake's diagnosis of heart failure, accepted the explanation that mysterious low-country diseases claimed lives without warning, accepted that death was simply part of plantation life. She never questioned why Thomas's health had declined so rapidly, never wondered about the timing, never suspected the woman who had faithfully prepared his meals. There was one moment, though, that made Aminata's pulse quicken. It happened in mid-October, 2 weeks before Rebecca's planned departure to live with her sister in Charleston. Aminata was arranging flowers in the parlor when Rebecca entered unexpectedly. "Aminata," Rebecca said, her voice carrying that particular tone white women used when speaking to enslaved people. Not quite conversation, not quite command. Something in between that maintained social hierarchy while requiring response. "Yes, mistress." Aminata kept her eyes down, her posture respectful. "You cared for my husband during his final illness." "Yes, mistress. I did my best to follow Dr. Blake's instructions." Rebecca was silent for a long moment. Aminata kept arranging flowers, her hand steady despite the sudden tension. "Did he suffer greatly?" Rebecca finally asked. "He had difficult moments, mistress," Aminata replied carefully. "But Dr. Blake provided medicines that helped ease his discomfort." Another silence. Aminata risked a glance upward and found Rebecca staring at her with an expression that was difficult to read. Grief, suspicion, simple exhaustion. "You've been with this family a long time," Rebecca said. 13 years since Thomas purchased you." "Yes, mistress. You lost your son this past February." Aminata's hand stilled on the flowers. "Yes, mistress." "That must have been difficult." The words should have been sympathetic, but they landed flat, performative. Rebecca didn't care about Samuel's death, not really. She was simply going through motions of aristocratic compassion, the way wealthy white women were taught to acknowledge servants' losses without actually engaging with their humanity. "Yes, mistress," Aminata repeated, because there was nothing else safe to say. Rebecca nodded, apparently satisfied with this brief acknowledgement of mutual loss, as if a mother losing her 16-year-old son to preventable illness was somehow equivalent to a wife losing her 58-year-old husband to natural causes. "You may continue with your work." "Thank you, mistress." Rebecca left, and Aminata released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That was the closest anyone came to questioning her, and it wasn't really questioning at all. Just a widow momentarily connecting death to death without seeing the thread that bound them. November brought cooler weather and Rebecca's departure. She moved to Charleston permanently, taking 3 enslaved people with her as personal servants. James became the sole authority at Whitmore Plantation, and under his management, the plantation settled into new rhythms. Aminata's role didn't change substantially. She remained head cook, preparing meals for James and his occasional guests, managing the kitchen staff, maintaining the herb garden that provided both culinary and medicinal plants. But something about her status shifted subtly. James treated her with a degree of respect his father never had, addressing her by name rather than girl or you there, occasionally asking her opinion on menu planning, trusting her judgment about household management. This wasn't equality. It wasn't even kindness in the pure sense, but it was different. And different mattered in slavery, where every tiny variation in treatment could mean the difference between bearable and unbearable existence. Winter arrived at Whitmore Plantation with unusual severity in December 1843. The rice paddies froze over 3 times. something the old-timers said they hadn't seen in 20 years. The enslaved people huddled in their quarters at night, sharing body heat, burning whatever wood they could collect during daylight hours, surviving the way they always survived, through communal resilience and the stubborn refusal to let harsh conditions claim them. Aminata spent the winter months teaching. Not formally, formal education was forbidden to enslaved people in South Carolina, punishable by whipping or worse. But teaching happened anyway, in whispered conversations after dark, in demonstrated techniques while working, in stories that seemed like entertainment but carried practical knowledge. She taught young women about plants, which ones stopped bleeding, which ones eased childbirth pain, which ones prevented pregnancy when slavery made bringing children into bondage feel like cruelty. She taught them to recognize foxglove, oleander, water hemlock, white snake root, not telling them explicitly what she had done, but making sure they understood that knowledge itself was power, that even powerless people could access tools if they knew where to look and how to use them carefully. She taught them subtlety, how to appear compliant while maintaining internal resistance, how to read white people's moods and adjust behavior accordingly, how to survive without losing the essential self that slavery constantly tried to crush. These lessons weren't written in books. They couldn't be, but they passed from woman to woman, generation to generation, creating an invisible curriculum of resistance that white people never saw because they never imagined enslaved people possessed that level of sophisticated strategic thinking. One particularly cold night in January 1844, Aminata sat in Esther's cabin with 5 other women, ostensibly helping to repair quilts, but actually engaged in something more significant. The youngest woman there, Patience, was 17 and newly arrived at Whitmore Plantation, sold from a failed plantation in Georgia. She had been raped repeatedly by her previous master and was struggling with the trauma, with the question of whether to keep living or to take the final escape that some enslaved people chose when existence became unbearable. Esther had asked Aminata to speak with Patience, recognizing that Aminata understood grief in ways that might reach someone standing on that terrible edge. They sat in a circle, needles moving through fabric, conversation developing slowly. "My mama used to say," Aminata began quietly, "that surviving is its own kind of resistance, that every day we wake up and keep living despite what they do to us, we're proving they can't break us completely." Patience didn't look up from her stitching. "But what if I feel broken?" "Broken and destroyed aren't the same thing," Aminata replied. "Broken can be mended, if not back to what it was, then into something new. Destroyed is gone completely. You're still here, still breathing, still thinking, still feeling. That means you're not destroyed." "I don't know if I want to keep breathing," Patience whispered, the words barely audible. The other women continued sewing, their silence creating space for this dangerous honesty. Suicidal thoughts were common in slavery, but rarely spoken aloud because speaking them made them too real, too possible. Aminata set down her needle and looked at Patience directly. "I lost my son this past year, 16 years old, healthy and strong, and he died because an overseer forced him to work while sick. For months after, I wanted to stop breathing too. Every morning felt like punishment, like waking up to a world that had no place for joy anymore." "What changed?" Patience asked. "I found something to live for that wasn't joy," Aminata said carefully. "I found purpose. I made a decision that I would honor my son's memory in a way that mattered. I can't say more than that, but I can tell you that having purpose, even dark purpose, kept me alive when nothing else could." She paused, choosing her next words with care. "But here's the truth they don't want us to know. The masters, the overseers, the whole system needs us more than we need them. Without our labor, their wealth disappears. Without our submission, their power crumbles. Every day we survive, we prove their system and can't kill us. Every day we maintain our humanity despite their attempts to make us animals. We win a small victory." Another woman, Martha, spoke up. "My grandmother told me something before she died. She said the ancestors are always watching. They see what we endure, and they remember. She said one day, maybe not in our lifetime, but someday, there will be a reckoning. The children we raise, or their children, or their children's children, they'll be free. And they'll remember us, remember what we survived, remember that we held on long enough to make their freedom possible." The conversation continued for another hour, weaving between grief and hope, between acknowledgement of trauma and determination to survive it. By the time the women dispersed back to their own cabins, patients seemed steadier, not healed, but perhaps less close to that terrible edge. Aminata walked back to her cabin thinking about Martha's words, about ancestors and future generations. She had killed Thomas Whitmore, had taken deliberate action to end a life, and she still didn't know if that action would be judged as righteous or sinful when her own time came to face whatever judgment existed beyond death. But she knew this. Her action had meaning. Samuel's death had been answered. The scales had been balanced as much as they could be in a system designed to keep them eternally unbalanced. Spring came early in 1844, bringing new life to the plantation gardens and new challenges to the enslaved community. James Whitmore, now fully established in his role as master, announced his engagement to Eleanor Hastings, daughter of a wealthy Charleston shipping family. The wedding was planned for June, which meant months of preparation, extensive work for everyone in the big house, and the arrival of Eleanor herself in April to oversee the arrangements. Aminata met Eleanor Hastings on a warm April morning when the future mistress arrived to inspect her new home. Eleanor was 23 years old, educated at an exclusive school in Charleston, fluent in French, accomplished at piano, and possessed of the kind of casual cruelty that came from never questioning one's own supremacy. Within a week of her arrival, Eleanor had dismissed 2 house servants for imagined insolence, ordered new discipline protocols that increased work hours, and designed a punishment system for minor infractions that involved standing in the sun without water for extended periods. She was, in many ways, worse than Thomas Whitmore had been because her cruelty came wrapped in aristocratic refinement, making it somehow more insidious. Aminata watched and learned Eleanor's routines, her preferences, her moods, her vulnerabilities. Not because she planned to poison Eleanor, she didn't. The act of killing Thomas had been specific to him, to Samuel's death, to a particular balance that needed restoring. It wasn't a general technique Aminata planned to employ against every cruel white person that would be both morally wrong and practically unsustainable. But watching Eleanor, understanding her patterns, gave Aminata a different kind of power. The power to anticipate, to avoid unnecessary punishment, to protect younger enslaved people from Eleanor's worst impulses by steering them away from situations that would trigger her cruelty. The wedding in June was an elaborate affair, over 200 guests, 3 days of celebrations, enslaved people working nearly 20-hour days to accommodate white people's endless appetites for food, drink, entertainment, and service. Aminata supervised the kitchen operations with ruthless efficiency, ensuring everything ran smoothly because smooth operations meant less opportunity for punishment. She was exhausted by the time the last guest departed, but she had successfully navigated the chaos without losing anyone to Eleanor's punishments, without incidents that would have resulted in whippings or other violence. This kind of success, invisible to white people, was profound within the enslaved community. Aminata's reputation as someone who could manage dangerous situations, who possessed knowledge and strategic thinking that kept people safe, grew stronger. As months passed and 1844 became 1845, Aminata settled into her role as elder, as keeper of knowledge, as the person younger enslaved people came to with questions, problems, and fears. She taught them what she could, shared what was safe to share, and carried alone the dangerous knowledge of what she had done to Thomas Whitmore. Only Esther knew, or suspected strongly enough, that it amounted to knowing. They never spoke of it directly, but sometimes late at night, when insomnia plagued them both, they would sit together in companionable silence, and Esther would say things like, "Sometimes justice wears unexpected faces," or "The ancestors work through willing hands," phrases that acknowledged without accusing, that understood without condemning. Years accumulated. 1845 became 1846, became 1847, became 1848. Aminata aged, her hair turning fully gray, her hands developing arthritis that made detailed kitchen work increasingly painful. James and Eleanor had 3 children. Enslaved people were born, lived, and died. The plantation continued its cycles of planting and harvest, profit and loss, cruelty and survival. In 1850, Aminata was 50 years old and beginning to feel the weight of decades of hard labor. James, recognizing her declining physical capacity, shifted her role from active cooking to supervisory position, allowing younger women to handle the heavy physical work while Aminata directed operations and maintained the herb garden. This change gave her more time, more freedom of movement, more opportunity to teach. She spent increasing hours in the quarters, officially tending to sick people as plantation healer, but also serving as counselor, teacher, and living repository of knowledge that extended back to Africa through her mother's memories. Young people would ask her about the old country, about Africa, and Aminata would tell them what she remembered and what her mother had told her. Stories about kingdoms where Black people ruled themselves, where they were scientists, artists, warriors, merchants, fully human beings engaged in complex civilizations. These stories countered the lies that white people told, lies that Africans were primitive, that slavery was somehow civilizing, that Black people needed white authority to function. She taught them secret histories, taught them about Haiti, where enslaved people had successfully revolted and created their own nation, proving that Black people could govern themselves and defeat white armies. This knowledge was dangerous. Sharing it could result in execution, but Aminata shared it anyway, because young people needed to know that resistance was possible, that freedom had been achieved elsewhere, that their condition wasn't natural or inevitable. In 1851, something extraordinary happened. A young enslaved man named Isaiah, recently arrived at Whitmore Plantation, revealed to Aminata that he could read and write. This was rare, valuable, and incredibly dangerous. Literacy was forbidden. Teaching enslaved people to read was a criminal offense, but Isaiah's previous master had allowed it accidentally through negligent supervision, and Isaiah had taught himself using discarded newspapers and books. Aminata saw opportunity. She arranged for Isaiah to secretly teach reading to a small group of trusted young people, classes held late at night in different locations to avoid detection, using the light from fireflies caught in jars because candles were too visible. This underground school operated for 3 years before discovery forced it to shut down, but in those 3 years, 17 enslaved people at Whitmore Plantation learned to read. This was resistance of a different kind than poisoning Thomas Whitmore. This was building capacity, creating tools for future freedom, investing in liberation that might not come in Aminata's lifetime, but which she was helping to prepare for. And in some ways, this felt more meaningful than individual vengeance. This felt like honoring not just Samuel, but all the children, all the future generations who deserved better than slavery. The 1850s brought increasing national tension about slavery. Aminata heard fragments of information from white people's conversations, from newspapers James left lying around, from travelers who stopped at the plantation. There was conflict between states that permitted slavery and states that had abolished it. There were debates in Congress, violence in territories. a growing sense that the current system couldn't be sustained indefinitely. This information filtered through the enslaved community, creating cautious hope mixed with realistic fear. Change might be coming, but change could make things worse before making them better. White Southerners, sensing threats to their power, often responded with increased violence, stricter laws, more brutal enforcement. Hope was dangerous, but abandoning hope entirely meant surrendering to despair. Aminata, now in her mid-50s, found herself thinking more about legacy. She had lived through 38 years of enslavement. She had survived the Middle Passage, survived the auction block, survived decades of labor and loss. She had borne a child and lost him. She had killed a master and gotten away with it. She had taught dozens of young people skills that might save their lives or help them claim freedom. What would her life mean when it was over? This question occupied her thoughts during quiet moments in the garden, while harvesting herbs, while watching the sun set over rice fields that had been built by enslaved labor, watered by enslaved sweat, and enriched by enslaved blood. She didn't have complete answers, but she had fragments. Her life meant something because she had refused to be passive. She had refused to accept that being enslaved meant being powerless. She had used knowledge as a weapon, patience as strategy, and love as motivation for action the white people never saw coming. In late 1856, Esther died peacefully in her sleep at age 85. Her funeral was attended by over 100 enslaved people, 3 generations, who had known her wisdom, benefited from her counsel, and learned from her example how to survive with dignity intact. Aminata spoke at the burial, standing beside the grave, in the same cemetery where Samuel lay, where Thomas Whitmore had been buried with ceremony and honor 13 years earlier. Sister Esther lived through things we can't imagine, Aminata said, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd. She survived because she was strong, but also because she was smart. She knew when to bend and when to stand firm. She knew when to speak and when to stay silent. She knew that survival isn't just about lasting through another day. It's about maintaining who you are inside, where they can't reach. She paused, looking at the young faces in the crowd, faces that didn't remember Thomas Whitmore, faces that represented the future. She taught us that knowledge passes on, that what we learn, what we experience, what we figure out about surviving, that doesn't die with us if we share it. It lives in the people we teach, in the children we raise, in the community we build despite everything trying to tear us apart. The burial ended with singing, spirituals that had double meanings white people didn't catch, songs about crossing over Jordan that meant both religious salvation and literal escape to freedom, songs about Moses and Pharaoh that were really about enslaved people and masters, about liberation and the hope that oppression couldn't last forever. Aminata was 63 years old in 1863 when news reached Whitmore Plantation that changed everything. President Lincoln had issued something called the Emancipation Proclamation. The details were confusing, filtered through white people's conversations and enslaved people's desperate hope. But the core message was clear. Enslaved people in Confederate states were declared free. Of course, declarations in Washington didn't immediately change reality in South Carolina. The Confederacy was fighting a war to maintain slavery, and plantations continued operating as they always had. But the declaration meant something psychologically. It meant the nation was moving toward abolition, that freedom wasn't just a distant dream, but an approaching reality. The Civil War ended in April 1865. Slavery ended with it. Aminata was 65 years old when federal troops arrived in South Carolina and informed enslaved people that they were legally free, that they could leave plantations, that they owned themselves now. The moment was surreal. Aminata stood in the quarters surrounded by people crying, laughing, praying, trying to comprehend a reality where white people no longer owned them. She felt numb, not unhappy but not joyful either, just numb, like her emotional system couldn't process the magnitude of change. She stayed at Whitmore Plantation for another month, not because she wanted to serve James and Eleanor, but because sudden freedom, without resources, without plans, without safe destinations, was almost as dangerous as slavery. She needed time to think, to plan, to decide what freedom meant for a 65-year-old woman who had spent 53 years enslaved. Eventually, she made her choice. She would go to Charleston, where freed people were establishing communities, where literacy was no longer forbidden, where she might find work as a healer in a context that didn't involve serving white people's every whim. Before leaving, she did one final thing. She walked to the cemetery, to Samuel's grave, to the unmarked patch of ground where her son had been buried 22 years earlier. She knelt there for a long time, talking to him in whispered Bambara, the language her mother had taught her, the language that connected her to Africa and ancestors and something older than slavery. "I kept my promise," she told him. "The man who killed you paid, and I survived to see freedom, Mama. Not just for me, but for everyone. You would have been 38 now. You would have lived as a free man, Samuel. I'm sorry I couldn't give you that, but I made sure your death mattered. I made sure he understood what he'd taken. And now I'm going to live free for both of us." She planted a small flowering plant on the grave, foxglove, with its beautiful purple bells, and if anyone who knew the truth saw it, they would understand the symbolism, justice blooming from soil watered by tears and vengeance. Aminata lived another 18 years as a free woman. She settled in Charleston, worked as a healer and midwife, taught reading to formerly enslaved adults who had been denied literacy. She never married, never had other children, never spoke publicly about Thomas Whitmore's death. But in private, with trusted friends, she told her story. Not as confession requiring forgiveness, but as history requiring remembrance. When Aminata died in 1883, at age 83, her funeral was attended by over 300 people, formerly enslaved people, their children, their grandchildren, people who had known her during slavery, and people who had only known her in freedom. They sang the same spirituals that had been sung at Esther's funeral, at Samuel's funeral, at countless funerals of people who had died waiting for freedom. They buried her in a freed people's cemetery, in a marked grave with a stone that read, "Aminata Mother, Healer Teacher, 1800-1883. No mention of slavery, no mention of vengeance, just the roles she had chosen for herself once choice became possible. But the story survived, passed down through generations, told and retold, modified and embellished, but never forgotten. The story of Aminata, who had possessed knowledge that became power, who had used patience as a weapon, who had proven that enslaved people weren't powerless, just constrained, and that intelligence combined with determination could breach even those constraints. Her story exists alongside other stories of resistance. Harriet Tubman leading people to freedom, Frederick Douglass speaking truth to power, Nat Turner raising rebellion, and countless unnamed people who poisoned masters, burned crops, ran away, broke tools, slowed work, maintained dignity, and refused to let slavery crush their humanity completely. These stories matter because they complicate the narrative. They remind us that enslaved people weren't passive victims waiting for white saviors. They were active agents in their own liberation, using whatever tools were available, making impossible choices in impossible circumstances, surviving and sometimes thriving despite systematic attempts to destroy them. Aminata's choice to kill Thomas Whitmore raises uncomfortable questions that don't have easy answers. Was it justice or murder? Was it morally defensible self-defense in a system that offered no legal protection? Was it understandable maternal grief transformed into vengeance? All of these? None of these? The questions persist because they should persist, because moral complexity doesn't resolve neatly, because we honor historical truth by refusing to simplify it. What we know is this: A woman loved her son, lost him to brutality, and responded with calculated action that ended his killer's life. She lived with that choice for 40 years, never expressing regret, continuing to contribute to her community, teaching others, eventually dying respected and mourned. Her story survives because people chose to remember it, chose to pass it down, chose to honor the truth that resistance takes many forms, and that judging those forms requires understanding the context that created them. The Whitmore plantation doesn't exist anymore. The land was subdivided, sold, developed into other purposes. The big house where Thomas and Rebecca lived burned down in a fire in 1891. The quarters where enslaved people lived rotted and collapsed decades ago. The cemetery still exists, overgrown now, but still there. If you know where to look, you can find graves, though most markers have weathered away. But Aminata's story persists, not in official history books, those rarely recorded enslaved people's individual acts of resistance, but in oral traditions, in family histories, in the collective memory of communities that refuse to forget what their ancestors endured and how they survived it. This story matters because it's true in the ways that matter most. True to the reality of slavery's brutality, true to the grief mothers felt losing children, true to the intelligence and agency enslaved people possessed, true to the desperate measures survival sometimes required. Whether every detail happened exactly as told, we can't verify across 160 years. But the essential truth stands. Enslaved people resisted, and resistance sometimes meant violence, and we honor their full humanity by acknowledging that capacity rather than sanitizing history into comfortable narratives. Remember Aminata. Remember Samuel. Remember the millions whose names we'll never know, but who lived, loved, grieved, fought, and survived through slavery's darkness. Remember that freedom was won not just through war and legislation, but through countless individual acts of resistance, through knowledge passed down, through communities maintained, through refusal to be broken completely. And remember that the fight for justice continues. Slavery ended in 1865, but its legacies persist. The work of creating true equality, of addressing centuries of accumulated injustice, of building society where black lives matter as much as white lives, that work remains unfinished. Aminata's story reminds us that change requires action, that waiting for oppressors to voluntarily release power doesn't work, that justice sometimes requires uncomfortable choices and difficult truths. If this story moved you, stirred something in you, made you think differently about history or justice or resistance, then it served its purpose. Share it, discuss it, let it complicate your understanding of what slavery was and what it meant to survive it, and most importantly, let it inspire you to continue the work those ancestors started, the work of building freedom that's real, not just legal, the work of creating justice that serves everyone, not just the powerful. That's how we honor Aminata's memory, not by glorifying violence, but by understanding it, not by simplifying history, but by engaging with its full complexity, not by looking away from uncomfortable truths, but by facing them directly and learning what they teach us about human capacity for both cruelty and resistance, for both oppression and survival, for both grief and the determination to make that grief mean something. Remember the bayou where alligators hunted. Remember the gardens where foxglove grew. Remember the mothers who lost children and the choices they made in response. Remember that history is written by survivors, and sometimes survival requires actions that comfortable people find difficult to understand or accept. Remember, learn, and carry these stories forward so they're never forgotten, so the people who lived them are never erased, so the truth, complicated and uncomfortable as it is, survives to teach future generations what their ancestors endured, and how they fought back. This is Aminata's story. This is Samuel's story. This is one chapter in the long, ongoing story of resistance, survival, and the human refusal to accept dehumanization no matter how complete the system trying to impose it. Never forget,